I'm Dr. Mike Murphy. I have a PhD in computer science, and I teach computer science and information systems at Coastal Carolina University. In this lecture, I'm going to introduce web application servers. In particular, I'm going to discuss some of the properties of web applications, including the client-server model, the difference between static and dynamic content, and the idea of server state. I'll then discuss what web application servers do and talk about some important security considerations. Now, in the early days of the internet, websites looked something like this. There were very simple pages that displayed content and had links to other content. Everything was extremely static in nature, and one simply navigated between static pages by clicking on links. Now, this was a huge improvement over what came before that, which was simply repositories of files that you could access over a network. So you'd have entire books or documents that you'd have to download and read all at once, and have links between them. So this was a huge improvement over what came before it, but of course by today's standards this looks pretty Spartan. Something that looks more realistic by today's standards is this screenshot here. This is actually a screenshot of using Google Slides to make the screenshot that I just showed you. So, or to make the previous slide I should say. So this is a screenshot of an entire web application. And this web application is a complex program that's running on a server with the user interface moved to the web browser. This type of application actually replaces traditional desktop programs. So I'm actually making these slides using a web application instead of using something like PowerPoint on my local system. Now, the idea of putting the application inside the web browser is a relatively new concept. But the one huge advantage to putting an application inside a web browser is that if we use the web browser as the front end of the application, there is no need for that application to be running on the same machine as the browser. So the application can run on a different machine, and that different machine could be on the local network, or that different machine could be on a completely different network quite a long way away, accessed over the internet. So the client-server model, the program that's accessing the application, in this case typically the web browser, is the thing that we call the client, and the program that's providing the application is the thing that we call the server. So the client is the piece of software that accesses the application, and the server is the piece of software that implements the application. Now, this brings us to an immediate problem with terminology because we have two meanings for the word server. In this context, we mean the software application that can be accessed remotely by a client. But in the broader context, we often use the term server to refer to computer hardware or a virtual machine that is hosting these types of applications that can be accessed by the client. So it's a subtle but important difference between those two things. With web applications, we have the concept of both static and dynamic content. Static content is where the server simply transmits an existing file, which could be a text file, image file, some other type of static file, to the client, and the client proceeds to render that file and display it. With dynamic content, on the other hand, the actual content is generated on the fly, and it's generated on the fly by programs that are either running on the server, running on the client, or programs that are designed as a mixture of code that runs on the server and runs on the client. So the content doesn't exist prior to running the application, it's generated on the fly. Now we can look at client-side versus server-side code. We say code is client-side if it's running on the client. So code that runs inside the web browser, which is typically JavaScript code, is client-side code. Now, the client-side code can be served to the browser using a static file on the server. So just because we have client-side code in an application doesn't mean that our server is necessarily processing dynamic content. It can be sending static files to the client, and then the client could be running those things. Server-side code, on the other hand, is code that runs on the server, and the output of running this code is sent to the client for display. So if we have an application, a web application that's actually doing its processing on the server, we call that a server-side application. Now, we have this idea of server state. When we're serving static content, we consider our server to be stateless. That means that any request that we send for the same URL is going to receive the same response. It's going to receive the same file, the same content, and there aren't any dependencies between requests. If I request a static file off a web server today, and I request that same static file off the web server tomorrow, unless someone's gone in and manually updated that file, I'm going to get the same file tomorrow that I got today. If I'm dynamically generating the content I'm going to send out, though, things are a little different, because the application generating that dynamic content may be stateful. That means that the application itself that's running on the server can save data to the server, and the responses that I get later can be different, because the server might send a slightly different response or a completely different response based on data I saved earlier. An example again would be these slides that I'm using Google Slides to do. I'm saving these slides on the server. If I modify this presentation, next time I go and access these slides, they'll be different than they are now, because I'll be accessing the saved version and not the version that I accessed before I started editing them. So your typical web application is a mixture of client-side and server-side code. It utilizes both server-side processing and client-side JavaScript. It also mixes dynamic and static content. Typically, there will be some static elements such as CSS files, style sheets, layout files, some images, other types of static content that will be mixed in with dynamically generated content. Many web applications these days are stateful, meaning that you can save data inside them. They can change the state of the server. And of course, speed matters. If the application's too slow, the human user is going to get impatient and go somewhere else. So we need some servers, again we're talking about server applications, that can transmit the static content and run plugins or other programs to generate dynamic content on the server side. And in most cases, with most web applications, we utilize more than one server-side program to implement the application. So typically we'll have multiple servers. Now there are some single server packages that pretend to be one server, like XAMPP for example. It's actually more than one server component inside that package, but you can think of it as being one package. On production systems though, on real servers that we would host to real websites, we don't run single setup packages like that because they tend to have too many security holes. So instead, we typically install the software manually, typically on multiple machines. So the client will talk to some kind of a front-end server, often that does load balancing, and it will redirect the client's requests to one or more application servers that store data on a back-end database server, and that database server also has replicas in case the primary server fails. So there's quite a bit of complexity in a typical production web application that requires several different systems to implement. At the same time, we're trying to deliver this application in an efficient manner. We're trying to keep the application reliable. We're trying to keep the human users happy. But at the same time, the application server is typically being attacked. One of the things a system administrator must do is provide the capabilities of the systems, keep the systems up and running, keep them working for authorized users, while keeping out unauthorized users and keeping out attack attempts. Here's an actual attack attempt. This is a brute force attempt to try to hack into our WordPress content management system on a server. And this is actually an IP address that traces back to the People's Republic of China, and they're actually attempting to run scripts to try to break into our server. And one thing about system administration is we don't want those types of attacks to succeed. Now, why would people bother to attack, our server? I mean, we have a kind of a arcane research group website. It's not really anything worth breaking into, so to speak. But a few reasons that people engage in attacks on web applications. One of them is vandalism, trying to deface a website or an application, or in many cases upload illicit content to a target machine. This content could be child pornography, this content could be stolen music or video files, anything that would not be legal or ethical to distribute using regular public distribution channels. Another type of attack is a command and control attack, where to try to take over a target server and use that machine as a platform for doing other bad things like sending spam or doing some currency mining or using that command and control system as a platform to attack other systems. Denial of service is another type of attack. This is an attempt to prevent legitimate users from accessing or using a site or an application. So if you try to deny service, you try to take down a site and prevent people from using it. These are fairly easy to guard against if the attacker is coming from one place on the internet. So these are normally launched against a target from a distributed botnet of attacking systems in what's called a distributed denial of service, or DDoS attack. And of course, there's good old-fashioned theft. People just want to steal secret information, steal corporate secrets, that type of thing. So, good rule of thumb: if you run a web application server, it is going to be attacked. It's guaranteed. There's no question about it. It may take a while before you see your first attack, but you will be attacked. The goal is to secure that server and keep the web application running for legitimate users, while at the same time keeping the unauthorized users from successfully attacking the system. So it's a huge balancing act. If you make the web application server extremely secure, I mean, one easy way to do that is unplug it and put it in a closet. It won't be able to be accessible by the users. So that's not good. At the same time, if you make the server completely open with no security protections whatsoever, it's going to get taken over by somebody else, and you're very quickly not going to be the system administrator anymore, because somebody, probably in another country, is going to have taken the system over. So to summarize, a web application server, the main thing it's doing is it's hosting a combination of files and programs that collectively implement an application that we access remotely from a client. We are always concerned about security from day one. It's a primary consideration. It's not something we bolt on after the fact. That is something that I must instill in you in considering these types of servers. Is every time you do anything with a server, you need to be thinking about the security implications of the action you're taking. Thank you for watching. For more information, including additional lectures, please visit my website at www.mikemurphycs.com. Due to a high volume of email, I am unable to respond to questions that are not from Coastal Carolina University students. For admissions information, please visit www.coastal.edu. This lecture is copyright 2014, Dr. Mike Murphy, and is released under Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 3.0 Unported License.